right now, I would like to introduce you to a gentleman who I've always found to be a solid leader in Washington, D.C., doesn't mince words in any way whatsoever, and a man that I certainly want to see go back to D.C. after this next election coming up. Will you please welcome Iowa Congressman Steve King.
Thank you, Chris. I want to thank you all for coming out here today. You know, it's easy enough for us to go off and golf or go to the lake or sit around and watch a little TV or do whatever we might do with our families, maybe work in the yard. But we've got a country to save. And we've been at this for some time. And I would just dial this back in my earlier part of my upbringing. I grew up in a law enforcement family. My father was a manager of state police radio stations, and I grew up with law enforcement people around me. And these were city police, county officers, state officers, and sometimes federal officers. There never was any idea that the federal government had some kind of an exclusive lock on enforcing a federal law. If they needed help enforcing the law, we helped all the way down the chain. And if we needed the feds to come in and help us, they came in and helped all the way down the chain and all the way up the chain of law enforcement. And that's because, as this was branded in my little impressionable brain, that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land, and the laws that are written appropriately under it, you abide by them. And if you don't like those laws, we have a means to change them. And in fact, if you don't like the Constitution, there's a means to amend it. But we are a nation of laws, not of men. And one of the great reasons for this civilization, and I use the term proudly when I say civilization, when I talk about America, one of the great reasons is the rule of law. And I could go through the list of the pillars of American exceptionalism. It's pretty short. Most of it's in the Bill of Rights: freedom of speech, religion, the press, the right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances, like we're doing here today, exercising several of our constitutional rights that are wrapped up in the First Amendment. The right to keep and bear arms. The property rights that existed in the Fifth Amendment before the Kelo decision, and hopefully one day will exist again. It goes on: no double jeopardy, you face a jury of your peers, a quick and speedy trial. The powers that are not delegated to the federal government go to the states or respectively to the people. This is the foundation of this great country that we are. And we cannot be a great country if we don't have this other pillar of American exceptionalism called the rule of law. Now, you all sent me off to Congress a few years ago, and I found myself on the immigration subcommittee. And there I've sat through, I believe, more hours of testimony there than anybody else that's in Congress today. If you couple that with reading testimony and looking at reports and giving speeches, there isn't any doubt about that in my mind. But they would always bring us a witness for each panel in each hearing, and that witness would be one or sometimes more that would testify as to how many people died in the Arizona desert trying to get into the United States, or actually having got into the United States, trying to penetrate the rest of the way into the United States. And that number, as I watched, went from around 240 a year on up to some number not quite 500 a year. Now, that's appalling to think of those people that have lost their lives in the desert, but that seemed to be the only story. So I began asking the witnesses, can you tell me, you're here as an expert, aren't you? And they would say, well, yes. Well, good. Now you've testified how many people died in the Arizona desert trying to make their way on further into the United States. Tell me, if you will, how many people in America died at the hands who did make it across the border and into the United States? How many? And as I asked that question going down the panel, and panel after panel, it would lock up the witnesses. They weren't ready for that question. They hadn't somehow thought that there's a price that's paid here in America for laws that aren't enforced at our border and in the interior and the domestic enforcement of the United States. And so finally, these witnesses that were not experts, I found one that was. And his name's Mike Cutler. He's a former INS agent. And he didn't know the question was coming. But when I asked him that question, I said, how many Americans died at the hands of who came across the border and were unlawfully present in the United States? And he said, I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you it will be in multiples of the victims of September 11th. Think of that. multiples of the victims of September 11th. And I've since that time commissioned 2 GAO studies that prove that beyond any doubt. The criminal aliens that are incarcerated in our federal penitentiaries rate between, and depending on which study, between 28 and 30% of the inmates in our federal penitentiaries, criminal aliens. Well, you have to presume they're committing 30% of the crime. They're not there for crossing the border. We don't lock people up for that anymore, do we? We have a president who has essentially said, I'm going to grant administrative amnesty to everybody unless you make me feel uncomfortable politically. That's the analysis. 2 years ago, the president implemented DACA language and the Morton memos. DACA stands for Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals. It actually means deferred action for criminal aliens. And so he has suspended the law. And we've seen these numbers that show that if you can get into America, you have a 98% chance of staying in America. Now that's the numbers. Now if you're part of these that are coming across McAllen in that area, and you're an unaccompanied minor, that number now is 0.1% returned. 0.1% returned. That's it. So when their parents learn here from the coyotes in places like Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, that they can smuggle them into the United States for say $6,000, $7,000, or $8,000. Some of the families already here, they send money back there. They pay the coyote, which is like a real estate agent in their community, who brings a group of them up into the United States. And once they get into the border, what happens? We're not putting them in Tent City. We didn't call Sheriff Arpaio over to McAllen, Texas to build a tent city so we could house these 57,000 unaccompanied minors that have come into the United States. By the way, that's 1/5 of the total population of those that we have apprehended coming into America through that sector, 1/5. So 57,000 times 5, that gets you to the number that we're really talking about. And by the way, we don't interdict any 100% of those that try. The highest number the Border Patrol would testify to is 25%. So if we're stopping 25%, stop them temporarily and then turn them loose, by the way, you still have to multiply that number times 4 to get to the number of attempted crossings. It's well over 1 million attempted crossings each year in a border. We had 11,000 a night at the peak. 11,000 a night. People say, how many is that? 11,000 a night infiltrating across our border. That's right at twice the size of Santa Anna's Army. Now it's about exactly the size of Santa Anna's Army. And some say it's not an invasion. What would it take for it to be an invasion? If Santa Anna's Army came over the border the size of that every single night, and that went on for 10 years, would you consider it to be an invasion? I do. And I consider it to be a destruction of our rule of law. I consider it to be an assault on the pillars of American exceptionalism. And the President of the United States is doing this. Why? I don't know if either any of them are reasons. I can tell you that his vision of America isn't like our vision of America. That we know. Now, I don't assert where he was born. I will just tell you that we are all certain that he was not raised with an American experience. So these things that beat in our hearts when we hear the national anthem and when we say the Pledge of Allegiance doesn't beat the same for him. If you remember, when he was a candidate for president, he was standing at the front of a row of Democrat candidates for president down at Tom Harkin's Steak Fry. The rest of them, when they played the national anthem, had their hand over their heart. But Barack Obama was standing with his arms down his side, dangling beside his sides, while the national anthem was being played. Now, what was that about? Was it an act of defiance? I don't think so. Some thought so. I think it just was that, just like if we say, bow your heads, please, you will bow your heads because you expect a prayer. We grew up in this kind of a culture and environment where when we hear our national anthem, we stop. We take our hats off. We place our hand over our heart and we gaze at the flag with admiration and appreciation for those who have gone before us and what they have done. And now we have our challenge. We have a challenge of an invasion that's pouring people across this border. We have a situation where the president is hiding behind a 2008 law. This 2008 law that says if you're an unaccompanied minor, you can be you can be brought into the United States and handed over to Health and Human Services. It's within 72 hours, shall be or should be within 72 hours of the time that you're apprehended. And now it gives that's for exceptional circumstances. When you have 57,000, it's no longer exceptional.